Welcome back, guys, to another episode. So this one's for all the artists listening, especially those that believe LinkedIn is not really the place for you as an artist for advertising. This episode is to prove you wrong. We have a really esteemed artist with us today in studio, Adrian Owen. Welcome. And funny enough, I found him on LinkedIn, of all places. Yeah, I actually saw some of his work before LinkedIn. Go ahead.
I can't believe it. LinkedIn works.
It's so funny. I remember you were telling me, Adrian, that it's when you did your website that the website designer was like, we need to create a LinkedIn profile for you, and you were a little bit hesitant.
Well, I think anyone in the business sector, and I mean, art is part of the. I don't only do fine art. I actually illustrate for publishing companies and film and advertising, and it's almost imperative. But the way I understand it is, like any platform, it only works for you as much as you work it. So you have to apply yourself to the platform. You got to use it. You got to post. You got to get involved. Excuse me. You got to be there to make it happen. And it's definitely not on the top of my list of platforms to get involved in. It's really actually a typical case of artists having to self motivate the marketing aspect. Generally speaking, we're doing all our own marketing. So from that perspective, it can get a little overwhelming. There are so many platforms. You got to, obviously Instagram is like your first port of call nowadays, and that's obviously just shares off to Facebook. And which I try and avoid at all costs, and then and then you've got LinkedIn, and you've got all these other, so it can get a little overwhelming to try and. But I do believe that Meta has a suite now, and there are a couple of other, apps and platforms where you can actually manage it all together in one place. Which is more admin, which isn't my strong suit.
I think it's not many of our strong suits.
No, that's true. And it'll be quite interesting to talk a little bit more about sort of that dichotomy between the art side of the art business and the marketing side of the art business. But before we get into that, let's turn the clock back a little bit, just to get a little bit of the context, a little bit of the background. I think there are a lot of people in our audience that are either fine artists or have a hobby in one of the fine art spaces. And there's always that voice in the back of your head that tells you, this is not something you can take further. You're not one of these famous people who can sell their artworks. And one of the things we found, as we've kind of been on this journey speaking to different creatives, is that everybody starts out in different places, but it's kind of that commitment to their interest that kind of gets them across. So can you share with us a little bit about kind of how you got into this space? Like, is it something that you started all the way back in school? Is it a thing that you picked up later down the line? Where did the creative journey begin for you?
So I've actually looked this up in terms of I've done a bit of searching online for a thesis on the DNA dynamic, the actual DNA dynamic of artistic inheritance, because I've actually really tried really hard to try and work in other fields and in other industries, and always come back to art as a port of call. I mean, when I say I've tried, I mean, I just have to be an artist, and it's almost as if the universe itself has dictated. Even when I've had some wonderful experiences working on yachts in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, and building boats and doing all kinds of interesting stuff, but it always came back to art, and even on those experiences was drawing. And it began for me way back in school. And when I should have been doing mathematics, which I still can't do at all.
Hey.
You're among friends.
Amen.
Yeah, you're among friends.
Yeah, but I can draw a perfect circle with my hand. And I can draw a perfect line, and weirdly enough, I can draw a square with a pencil and ruler, and if you went and just freehand, and if you went and measured from point to point to point to point, it's almost always within a million, like I can draw a perfect square. So like I interestingly enough, I also do architectural renderings I do renderings for architects.
Wow.
So freehand drawings of buildings and
freehand. Wow.
Yeah. So and I've always had an interest in architecture, and I've designed buildings that I built. Also, in one instance, a building I designed in a diary, just so that I could illustrate to a bunch of people in the Transkei what I had in mind, and we used that drawing to actually build the drawing as a basis for building the drawing. So. Sure. I have a technical mind, but when I was supposed to be focused on maths, I was normally pretending to be focused on maths and scribbling in my book. And my first, or
rather applying it more in a better way. Maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yes and no, because while the math teacher was going on about maths, I was drawing falling angels, and because in Bible education at that particular time in my life, there were all these translations of stories, and so you had all these religious stories, and I would take them literally. The archangels of heaven were, I don't really know the story, but they were I think they were banished, and they were, they fell into the molten lava of hell, is what I remember the story being. They were banished and fell from the heavens into hell. And while the story was being told, I imagined this image, and I drew these, I drew these angels, and at the top of the page, they were whole, and they had wings, and as they flew, they started falling, and the feathers started falling from their wings, and as they got closer to the molten, lava, they became more skeletal, and then a couple of them plopping into the molten lava of hell. And someone at the school, I was in high school, and it would have been, I was 15 years old, and it was my first sort of 15 minutes of fame, if Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame. And it was my first sort of moment of and someone thought it was like the best thing ever, and took it down to the library, made 200 copies, and dispersed it through the school, which resulted in me being called into the headmaster's office and having to see the school psychologist for the next 3 months.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Yeah, it didn't turn out the way I thought that story would.
Yeah, they thought that I might be,
interesting.
Yeah.
Not religious. So
dabbling in extracurriculaire activities.
Anyway, so that's where it began, and then I just scribbled always. It was a means to an end for me. It was a way to sort of translate thoughts into, and I scribbled. I used to dibble and dabble. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because what you're describing is a very vivid image, and especially in my schooling time, I was also pretty interested in art, specifically pencil drawing. And I think one of the things I struggled with is that I struggled very much to visualize images. I could almost describe an artwork to myself and then draw it, but I couldn't actually picture the image. I didn't have an image in my mind that I was sort of trying to create. Can you talk a little bit, and at that point in time, did you already know that you had a little bit of a gift in art, or was it kind of more just sort of feeling your way through the kind of like the artistic process?
I was completely winging it. I mean, it was just really, I was a child who, I mean, 14, 15, I'd always, had an inclination, but I'd never been encouraged. And even as a young professional, my father, bless his heart, right now is actually an illustrator himself. But at the time, I taught him how to illustrate.
No way.
Yeah,
Wow.
many
That's
years
beautiful.
later, like a good,
Sure.
yeah. But a decade or so before that, more than. He was like, yeah, you need to get a proper job, like you can't make a living as an artist. And he might have been right. it's a tough gig. It's a tough gig. It really is a tough gig, but it's incredibly rewarding. And interestingly enough, yesterday I read an article, as it turns out, and I know this as a matter of fact. I also was doing a bit of sleuthing last night related to some work I'm doing, and Aspire Auctions, based in Johannesburg, I think, recently had some auctions, and I'm working with an agent at the moment, and yeah, there is buckets and buckets and buckets of money to be made in the industry. And if it's a very convoluted and very interesting industry, so don't let anyone tell you can't make a living in the art world.
Yeah.
It's a multi-billion dollar, pound, euro industry. It's
I think even more so now, and it's going to increase because of the space we are with technology and what people are starting to value more and less in the world of digital, non-digital, physical, non-physical, self-created, machine-created, all of those things. It does definitely, for me personally, I've started valuing art pieces created by local artists a lot more than any other things. So I can understand that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I went to an exhibition just 2 nights ago, and the first time I've ever seen AI developed artwork on exhibition at an exhibition.
Interesting.
So yeah, really interesting. But to get back to Alfie's question, I used art at the time because I was young and my parents had divorced, and it was a messy thing. There was a lot of emotional stuff going on. Which, I mean, come on, we were all teenagers, and the teenage years are tumultuous years. You got hormones kicking left, right, and center. There's a lot going on, but it just happened to coincide with my father getting remarried and being displaced and going to an agricultural boarding school in the middle of frickin' nowhere. So young artistic inclined person at a agricultural boarding school in the northern provinces. It was a tough, rough school, and but looking back, it was an interesting time. But it was. For me, I think it's different for very different people, like the actual artistic process. So it's going to be very different. Someone like you, for instance, might struggle to visualize. You could describe the image, but then to make the image might be harder for you to do. But whereas in my case, it was a case of actually having these images in my head that needed to be like get out and be visualized. But it also became a form of cathartic process for me. I used it as a means of expressing emotional stuff. So lots of, angry teenage angst, if you will, coming out in those drawings. And right from the onset, looking back now as I talk about it, it had a lot to do with the human dynamic as opposed to I wasn't so much drawn to objects or realism in terms of flowers, plants, landscapes, that kind of thing. It was all very figurative. So each person's obviously going to, that's the beauty of it. Everyone's going to find some niche, some form, like some way through the creative process. But sorry, Stephanie, I've got a young woman in my life at the moment who is 18 years old and has a lot of talent. She's still in high school. She's and just on this note of where it begins for everybody, I look. She shows me her drawings, and she's way and above where I was at 18. And she's like, no. She looks at my work now, and she's like, no ways. And I'm like, dude, seriously, if I showed you what I was doing at 18, you would laugh. Like it was so rudimentary. I think I had 1 year of art in high school, in matric. That was it. And the art teacher was very uninterested in technique and style. And she was just doing a job, and she just had to get us through the syllabus. And it was like, okay, go do this and go do that and good luck. And so we kind of winged it. And but yeah, it's really... It's practice. It's practice. Anyone can be an artist if they. It's actually almost like there are two aspects. You either have a very natural inclination for it and natural talent, which is inherent, which is what I think is my case. Like I just have it. My grandmother was a watercolorist. My father and his brothers all had artistic inclination, despite never becoming professional artists themselves. They had artistic inclination. My eldest uncle sculpted a little. My youngest uncle did a bit of sculpting.
Definitely in your blood.
So it's kind of like a bloodline thing, which is actually very interesting, as I was saying, and looking up a thesis in terms of DNA. So that's like an inherent DNA dynamic. But then there's so many other aspects to it, and but it doesn't matter where it comes from. If you have an inclination to make art or create art or be in the arts, it's really just a case of constant pursuit and practice. And you're always going to start out at the beginning, basic, rudimentary. It's like everything in life, and which is the wonderful thing about art, because it's such a wonderful metaphor for life itself. And then you just practice. You get better, and I'm self-taught. I've never been. So. Yeah.
That's crazy. So, you mentioned this 18-year-old woman that you have it sounds almost like an apprenticeship. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that, because that topic alone is going to make Alfie, as you can see, very happy. He's very interested in mentorship and apprenticeship at the moment. But I actually want to take a moment and just pause, because as you were speaking about your journey, I think it's worth honoring it as well, in a way that you've mentioned very distinct moments where you were discouraged for your ability of creation and expression a few times now in your story. And it's very interesting for me that you kind of just kept going. The first time was when you had to go see the school psychologist because your piece was so amazing that it was sprayed through the school, but it was obviously deemed as something unnatural or a little bit strange. So there was like discouragement. Then you had a little bit of turmoil in your life, and that could have been another moment of discouragement, but you kind of use that as a tool to self-soothe. Then you went to a school where, again, it's not a very artistic school either. You said it was an architectural boarding school, so it's not a very
agricultural. It was agricultural. School. We had to wake up in the morning at like 4:00 and go milk cows.
Exactly, right? So again, that could be a moment or an opportunity to be like, let me focus on something else. And I mean, I've had that with myself as well. I did dancing for about 19 years of my life. And then when I was 19, just before I stopped, I had one bad experience with one specific ballet teacher. And I walked out and I like threw my ballet shoes on the floor, and I never looked back. And I was like, one bad experience that discouraged me from the journey. And I think there's something.
I'm really sorry to hear that, but there was always pros and cons, because at least you have nice toes.
Well, yeah, right. They were actually bleeding as I walked out of there, and that's part of why I left.
Yeah.
But
so, I'm sorry to hear that.
Me too.
No. I mean, it is. I have been discouraged, and in fact, even through school, it was, why are you drawing? You should be working. You should be doing. And I'm like, and it's just misunderstanding, because in our sort of education system, and teachers and people in general, people aren't very particularly educated in that respect, and they teachers, no offense intended, are trained to do a specific thing, and maybe it's just misunderstanding and miscommunication, and they don't really understand. But every child and every person is going to find a different way to communicate. It could be dance, it could be a creative,
output,
but when you're in school, dance doesn't apply in geography. And art doesn't apply in maths. You have to do that task, and that's the task you set. And so, and they're not seeing the artistic side. But if they had let you dance at the back of the class during maths, you might have actually got it right, because that expression and that self-realization would have actually helped you. Like if they, but you got to sit in a row, you got to sit in the line, you got to sit in the queue, you got to stand in the line, and it's like that's where. But it's through those experiences that you emerge. And I mean, it sounds like you pursued dancing nevertheless. It's like, in my case, it was, as I said, I've actually ended up trying to do other things because I thought that I had to, But quite honestly, by the time I was 19, 20, 21, I had already decided that I was going to pursue art as a means to an end. It had to be a thing. And even since then, I must tell you that it doesn't get better. It gets harder and tougher, because
it actually gets worse, because now
it just gets worse. It really does, But what happens is that you just learn to deal with the
difficulties.
What's the word I'm looking for?
Turbulence.
The discouragement and the the negatives. Because as you become through my professional career as an artist, I've been rejected numerous times. You enter a competition, perhaps, which I don't actually do as a rule, but I did 2 days ago for the first time ever. I entered the.
Hold on, there seems like there's a story behind there. Why is that a rule?
Well, I don't, as a rule, because I don't want to face honestly, quite honestly, like I don't want to really be disappointed by not. I don't need to win, but then I also feel like I don't need to prove myself. Like there's no necessity for me to enter competitions, but it's actually quite important as a professional artist to do so every now and then, and because it's
measure yourself.
You measure yourself. That's it, Alfie. You measure yourself. You're pitting yourself up against your contemporaries, and it's not really a case of who's better than who, because art is so subjective. It's not really a case that the winner of the competition is so much better than you are at what you do. It's so subjective. You've got 3 judges, maybe, who just, randomly picked from the
exactly. And it's like,
it's
the subject of those 3 judges.
It's so random. So, but there's a point for me where I just felt like I don't really need to prove myself. It's and if I'm honest, I just didn't want to deal with the rejection of not being, because it's quite hard. If you don't get into a competition, you start thinking to yourself, and it is all related to self-esteem, I think, for everybody. If you get rejected or you don't make it in, or you're like, oh, is that because I'm, bad at what I do? Is that because my work isn't good enough? Is that, so then you have to deal with all of that. So quite honestly, it's just easier not to enter. But I entered the Portrait Award this year.
Really?
The big the Rustin Frieda Portrait Award. It's like
wow.
It's the premiere. I did it like 2 days ago. Actually, the deadline is today. The 10th of June is the deadline. About 2 or 3 days ago, I entered, and it's the premier portrait award of in the country. It was initially sponsored by Sanlam, and then the Rupert Museum also sponsored it for a while. I think they might still be one of the sponsors, but it's run by the Rustin Frieda Gallery. First prize is 150K, and then second is 30, and third is 20, and there's a lot of prize money in it, and there's also a trip to Barcelona for a 2 weeks. So like and there are like 5 or 6 other prizes as well but it brings out the best talent. It brings out the best, and actually just making it into the top 100 is an achievement on its own, because that goes into a catalog, and so anyway, but threw caution to the wind this year, and I just entered. Go for it.
I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent, so I'm going to ask you to bear with me here. And it's an interesting story that I heard about. I think it's about Da Vinci. I hope I'm not wrong. But there's this idea about like the daemons, and I think there was eventually a show made about it. But it's this idea that he almost had this voice that would tell him to pursue specific artistic endeavors, whether it's a specific idea of a thing to create, something to design, but it was like this voice that he had to obey, and in its obedience he would create specific works of art. Now, I don't think necessarily everybody is that let's say literal in how they receive their creative inspiration, but one of the things that I think is interesting, which kind of was brought to mind when you were talking about your perspective about the competitions, is like one of the things that a competition does that gets in the way of the artistic expression, that it forces you in some, or it at least tempts you to almost like subjugate the art to the competition. Because one of the things, especially as I've kind of gotten a little bit older and read a lot about symbolism and more about some of the let's say scientific elements of creativity, it's become more and more clear that it's almost a way of seeing the world. And then in the actual expression, you're almost seeing the world in a specific way and communicating it with a language that isn't, verbal. And so when I think about the context of a competition versus creating a piece of art outside a competition, when you're in the competition, you're so tempted to try to win that you might do things that are not true to the artwork. But when you're sort of doing it outside of that context, and in a sense the art is coming first, you make decisions, whether it's about the stroke or the medium, because of the piece that you're trying to bring into the world. And I don't know if every artist, especially in your earlier years, can participate in a competition without almost doing the art itself a disservice. I don't know how, like, if you had any thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get what you're saying. I think some people will definitely, the same can be said for group exhibitions or exhibitions where an artist is invited possibly to participate in a group exhibition, which might have a title. So my first group show, after nearly 10 years of not really being involved, but I'd become a young dad, and my key focus was on my young son, and I wasn't really taking myself seriously as a fine artist, and had just broken my heart, was heartbroken, having ended a relationship, was flopping about in Cork Bay, walked into a gallery, an artist-run gallery, and a wonderful artist. Her name's Donna McKellar, and she had a gallery in Cork Bay at the time. And she looked up from her laptop and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "No, I'm an artist. I'm just having a look." And she said, "Oh, do you have a website? What do you do?" And I said, yeah, I have a, I was all miffed.
Classic
said,
artists trying to sell themselves.
really good selling today. And I was like, Adrian Owen.co.za, because also, the website's never good enough. Never, for me anyway. It's a transformative thing. It's constantly needing attention. It's got to be polished. It's got to be clean. It's got to be anyway. So she looks at it, opens it up, and she goes, "Oh wow," obviously, and she, because self-esteem, and she's like, "Oh wow, geez, you're not so bad," And she said, "Look, I'm throwing a maybe it was intuitive on her part, and she sensed something, and she said, I'm putting a group show together. Would you be interested in being involved?" And I was like, I just said yes. Maybe I didn't think. Maybe it was, But coming back to Leonardo and Da Vinci and Michelangelo, the man. I mean, geez, talk about rock star. And incredible. And coming back to that, but staying on track. I got involved, and she said the theme for the group exhibition was skullduggery. Skullduggery is underhandedness by definition. It originated in the sort of 18th century. It's apparently it has some ties to pickpocketing, like skullduggery. Skullduggerous behavior is like pickpocketing or doing under the table dealings. Politicians are very well known for skullduggerous behavior. They do, under the table dealings. Underhanded dealings is, and in a nutshell, to make a long story short, the work I produced over the next 3 months or so, because I had about that long, is seminal in my over. It's like it's. I still own them because they are too personal for anyone to have purchased. Although some art collectors came through my open studios a year or two ago, and they bought prints. They insisted, and I did the first edition of prints for them. Sure. They now live in the States, but they are seminal pieces in my portfolio. And I've had people walk in and hear the story related to the artworks and burst into tears and cry, and people are moved. In fact, last year at the Open Studios, a couple of friends of mine, two women that I surf with on a regular basis, walked in. And they walked in as I was telling some guests what the artworks were about. And the one just like you could see, she literally just sort of had a bit of a moment and just bolted. And I said, "Are you guys all right?" Afterwards, I got hold of them. I said, "Everything okay?" And she said, "No." The story and the work had hit her so hard that she had a moment.
Fight or flight.
It was a trigger. There were a lot of triggers for her, And so on the note of the competitions and being called to do the work and how it affects you, yes, definitely. But in all of those aspects, it's really a case of how much you as an artist are going to bend yourself to impressing people, or how true you're going to stay to yourself. And in that particular instance, with it was literally my first group show in Cape Town, and it was, essentially, thanks to Donna inviting me to be part of that
Wow.
exhibition, the beginning of the story for me here in Cape Town as a professional
Sure,
artist.
sure.
And I stayed true. I drew what I didn't care what people were going to think. I didn't care for. I used the platform or the invitation to be part of that exhibition as a cathartic process to my own emotional and psychological state of mind and place. And there was nothing political about my artwork at all in terms of the skullduggery. I played on the skullduggerous nature of the human mind and the human heart. I played on the own skullduggerous nature of my own heart and the choices that I make as an artist. And so that translated through the work. Going back to Michelangelo, Alfie, I think for some people, but not for all people, but for a lot of artists and for all of us I can't speak for everyone, but from my point of view, in my opinion, Michelangelo, for instance, would have tapped into the Akashic record and he, that connection to everything that is before and after, that universe. Looking back at Michelangelo's place in life, could Michelangelo Buonarroti have been anybody else other than who he was? Do you know what I'm saying? Like in the grand scheme of things, there had to be a Michelangelo. There had to.
It was a culmination of many things. Yeah,
it was a culmination of the universe working in its divine grace to kind of make that man who he was, the creative that he was. You've just got to find yourself in that space. You've got to tap into it. You've got to find your way into it. You've got to believe that you are kind of part of that dynamic. And if you hear a call, if there's some part of you that says, oh, you should draw, you should sculpt, you should maybe turn that block of wood into something, maybe you should just get up and dance. That's the definitive moment between making you a dancer or making you as someone who sits on the sidelines. Because if you if you don't listen to the voice and you go, no, I'm just going to sit here, then you've missed the opportunity and you haven't listened to that voice. But I think that that voice is within us. And what's happened to me through my life is it's been almost impossible to ignore. That's why believe me, I promise you, I sometimes look at my own life and go, oh my word, I'm a professional artist.
Oh, what a beautiful moment when that happens.
Like, I mean, this is what I do. I walk into the studio and I'm like, hey, this is what I do. This is what I am. This is who I am. I could have been a baker, a shoemaker, a yachtsman, because I actually have tried. As I said, I did some yachting. And I ended up sailing in the Caribbean. And if I'd pursued that, I could be sailing around the world and have stayed a yachty. I could have, become a yachtsman. But even as a yachtsman, on yachts, I was painting in the inside of the yachts. I'd have friends who sold a yacht. They owned a yacht that I painted inside. They took everything I painted in the yacht and put it into their new yacht. They are now sailing around the Australia and New Zealand. They're moving around, and they have in the yacht the medicine cabinet that goes about. I painted it. I did an elaborate painting. They sealed it, varnished it, and they now travel. It goes with them wherever they go. Yeah, and that was about 24, 25 years ago that I painted that.
That's crazy.
Thing.
Sure. Oh, what a nice memorabilia.
So, sorry, there's just a quick thing that I just want to almost, I want us to just appreciate for a moment, because I think one of the big critiques or hesitations that people might have about art is what its value is in the real world. When you think about the engineers, you think about the architects, you think about the shoemakers and the bakers and the yachtsmen, like they do a thing in the world that's very easy to kind of like it's very easy to see where the value is.
See a value, yeah.
with art, it's a little bit more different because the value isn't self-evident. In a sense,
yeah, but the same.
value is what happens
I need to
inside you.
interject. I need to interject, Alfie, because
Please.
the same is true of the architect. Okay, I shared a house. I shared a house once with an architect. He was a blunt tool. All right, he really was. I mean, the guy let some doofus off the street he let some guy walk in, and this guy said, Adrian said I could stay here. I came home from a photo shoot for Nissan, and my everything was gone. The guy some random dude cleared me out, and this blunt tool had let him in. And that architect is not that is a measurable architect. That guy is going to be renovating bathrooms for the rest of his life. You know what I'm saying? So
yes.
It is actually measurable. In architecture or in all of those things, there's an entry point, and then there's the higher tier. You've just got to decide, like in so many respects, and I know it's easier said than done. I know for some people it's harder than it is for others. With all due respect, it's not going to be, so easy. You don't just walk into it and just rise to the top. It's hard work. I've been a professional artist for a long time, and there are days where I feel like I'm, right down in the bottom tier. But then the next day I'll bump into someone. I have professional artists who are on the top tier, and they consider me to be more of an artist than they are. And so it's so relevant and so subjective. But I think what you were trying to say is, go.
Yeah, so I think what I was getting at, because I think what you've mentioned is really right. I think what I was talking about was less about the profession and more about the output of the profession. So, for example, an architect puts a building into the world, and this building is used for a business so that the business can work in that building, for example. Like an artwork, it's like that part is not as evident and as tangible, right? But then when you were speaking about that story about you kind of doing a little painting inside this medicine cabinet, this is like a tiny little space in a yacht in the middle of the sea. In some sense, you can think about it as almost irrelevant. But then the experience that a person has when they simply open a cabinet and see an entire artwork there, that's actually the thing that moment is the value that art brings.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And one of the reasons why I think art is so expensive is because it can keep creating that experience for every single person that looks at it.
It's almost
and
invaluable.
Especially the best work. And when you talk about the people like Michelangelo, the thing that makes him stand out is not the fact of the piece that is there. It's the fact that every person that looks at that piece has a transcendent experience. Yeah, and that to me is really what's at the center of what makes art valuable. And, I think it's one of the questions that I always wrestled with when I was trying, when I was exploring my path as an artist and in the space of drawing. The question of what is the value of art, I could never really come up with something tangible. And I think it was only in my later years, once I started reading a little bit about some symbolism and the business of art, that some of these maybe more abstract values started to become visible. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that specifically about the transcendent experiences in art.
I absolutely do, because it's shaped me, it's made me the man I am. Those transcendent experiences, when I say the man I am, I mean the person. The very nature of myself has been as a result of every little sketch and scribble that I've done myself. And then I remember as a teenager, Salvador Dali, obviously everybody knows old Salvador, but there was something for me specifically that resonated with me on such a deeper level with regards to his work. And yes, for me, the arts are such a vital part of human development and human development. The actual nature of humans has developed through art and architecture and dance and music. And I've always thought that music is so powerful. I'm never without it. When I'm working, I always have music in the background, and it's so powerful. It is a transcendent thing. It reaches into you. It tickles the heart. It tickles the mind. It's a transcendent thing, and that's what all this art is. Every little sketch, and I can actually on the shelf behind me, and in a box in the house, I have piles of diaries, and every little scribble has been a transcendent experience, because it's the very nature of drawing it is, or just expressing it, or trying to draw it out of the paper, like getting this pen and trying to make this thing happen, or just aggressively attacking the paper, is part of that experience. But in a nutshell, yes, the artists of the world, the Michelangelos of the world, the Picassos, the Dalis, all of them, just to name a few. I recently watched a very old, one of the first Van Gogh film made by. It was based on, I think, James Michener. I think it might have been somebody that I think wrote a story about Van Gogh. Anyway, I mean, what an incredible story, to have never sold an artwork all his life, but he only painted for 10 years of his life. He was dead by the time he was 30 something years old, these marvelous artists, and then I think of some of the architects of the world who art is such a key dynamic in the grand scheme of things. Right now, though, in the world, it's even more important than ever, I think, because with the advent and advancement of technology, and you've got capitalism, which is such a overbearing dynamic. It's all about money, and sales, and physical, also with the advent of social media, so many people in the world are pursuing this westernized dream of accumulation. So the capitalists are coining, because which is why art is so important still, because you want those transcendent aspects. You want humans to, even if they don't know it, to be spiritually, psychologically, lifted and drawn into experiences that actually tune them in to the grand scheme of creativity, if you will. Nature in itself is the same. Nature is the greatest artist of all, because it creates this, ever obvious, amazing sort of life that we live, which is kind of like art in so many ways. Art is transcendent. Yes, it is a lot more difficult to get a grip on, which is why it's so important that people should go to art galleries and they should go and see art. South African culture, sadly, is not designed for it. It's not really a key dynamic. South Africans are not that way inclined. It's not. It's still a young demographic. It's still a young aspect in this. There is a strong art world in South Africa, very strong, but comparatively speaking, it's not as well supported as as it is in Europe. Europe, art abounds. It's everywhere. It's actually in the architecture. There's art everywhere. Whereas in South Africa, it's not as present.
We don't have too much time left, but I really want to ask a question that that's been sitting with me for a while, and it takes me back to the story you told about when you walked into the gallery in Kalk Bay, and you were asked to join this group exhibition, and the space that you were in your life at the moment, you were going through a heartbreak, and then you did these pieces for this exhibition that are now some of the most precious pieces for you, and they have so much value personally, and it sounds like they create such an emotive experience for other people viewing them as well. Now, I personally have always been interested in the notion of the suffering artist. I think personally, I used to be a pencil artist as well in school, and then it kind of became more digital, and I still find that same level of satisfaction and expression in product design and app design, crafting digital experiences and digital things. But when I look through my journey, and I've noticed this a few times, when I've been in a state of suffering in my life, any type of suffering, any level of emotional displeasing experience, I have had access to more creative power than when I'm not in those states. And then you read these theses and papers about the suffering artists, and you look at some of the greatest artists of our time who generally find themselves in a state where they are experiencing some type of emotional or physical pain, and they create these really historical pieces, or they become historical figures. And I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, but I'm personally interested in your experience. I don't know if it's because for me, I have access to a broader spectrum of emotions when I'm either going through a breakup, heartache, pain, grief, or something like that. And that broader spectrum of emotions leverages itself to be creatively powerful, almost more so than when I'm not in that experience. So I want to hear from you, like, being a fine artist, and you've been one now for so long, so you can actually reflect a little bit more and share your experience of the times in your life where you've had a little bit of dips. Do you feel like the work is different that's come out of there in the value for you, the value for others, and the experience creating them versus the ones when you're not going through like a little turbulent part of your life?
Absolutely. No question at all. It's been argued that I've had a couple of people in my closest people say that I might, jokingly, almost sort of tongue in cheek, suggested that because I've never really had a relationship that lasted more than 2 years, but that's because, they weren't meant to be. It's not.
You did it on purpose.
It's not like I did it on purpose, but the argument was that I did, and jokingly, I got a couple of close friends, and they're like, "Actually, Adrian, I think you might be addicted to the heartbreak. Like you make it happen, like you self-sabotage the relationship because." And I've actually found myself sitting there thinking, I wonder how right that could be. Maybe.
I've had the same experience.
So maybe I do self-sabotage, and absolutely humans in their most darkest hour, that's when they're challenged. They really are. Like it's almost as if
We're also in a meditative state then, right? Because you're so hyper vigilant and aware of your own suffering that this hyper vigilant creates almost like a flow state we try and get into as creatives, but it's more easily accessible almost.
Yeah, but it's also a cathartic process of wringing it out, eliminating it, because intrinsically you don't want to feel that way. You love and happiness is what
you're looking for.
Is what you're looking for, and ironically and incidentally at the same time, like coincidentally, like the idea is that you you start drawing, you start working, you start processing the heartache, the dark, depths of your own soul, and because you're actually digging deeper into yourself to find where you lost the joy, where it went wrong, so those dark moments, those depressed states are, life is ebb and flow. It's ebb and flow. It can't always be flow. It has to ebb and flow. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. Life is the same. You have these happy moments, and you have these challenging and sad ones, and then you have these happy moments. If it was just a plateau of, easiness, what would it be worth? So, when you're in those dark moments, but yes, from my point of view, the best work I've ever created was when I was challenged to do it under duress or some kind of experience, that draws you to it. You find yourself, like the skullduggery pieces, for instance. I mean, that was real self-evaluation. There was so much heart and soul that went into those pieces, because it was a means to actually, in a nutshell, I wasn't looking back in a depressed state. Yeah, sure, I was heartbroken at the time, but I was drawing myself out of it, literally drawing with a pencil. I was literally pulling myself out, and like it's self-evaluation, which is what art is so good for in so many ways. I mean, aside from keeping your hands busy and your eyes busy and your brain ticking over and all the, multiple physical things that it does for you on a positive note, it's also such a revelation of yourself to yourself, which is so great.
Yeah. I just had like a little bit of a aha moment as you were speaking, because I was thinking about, Steph, where you started with that question, kind of when your life is in this sort of negative state, it almost puts you in tune with a different kind, maybe it's a different kind of flow state than when you're happy. And then when I was kind of listening to what you were speaking about, Adrian, it's like, it's the process of actually creating the art that draws you out of that negative experience. And then I think, maybe the thing that makes that kind of art valuable is that it's the fact that it's documenting a person's experience from being into a negative space, going through the cathartic process. And, it may not necessarily solve your problem, but it at least puts you in a place that you've given it a place in your mind. And you've given it a form so that it isn't this like formless negativity. And maybe that's actually that's what draws people to it. Because I think one of the things I found is when I'm in a bad mood, or having a negative experience, darker art speaks to me. Like the ones that are actually exploring
or
those
darker
types
music,
of subject
or
matter.
any type
yes,
of...
Yes. And as the audience, what you're almost doing is you're partaking in that experience with the artist. Although it's at a different point in time, you're still, in a sense, following that same sort of cathartic journey. And maybe that's kind of because I think that type of art also speaks to people in another way. Like in a way that's different from just a landscape that's well rendered and is hyper realistic. Like those types of artworks are good, but they're good for a different reason.
Yeah, because this European couple walked into my house. The skullduggery pieces are up above the couch. There's only two of them. The third one's quite sexual in nature, and could be a bit much for some, for the grannies and aunties and children. So I don't pull it out. Interestingly enough, though, on one occasion I did have a bunch of grannies in the house, and I told them that there was a third piece and it was quite sexual, and they were like, bring it out, we want to see it. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And I had this European couple, and in fact, I could tell you multiple stories about people who have looked at the skullduggery pieces and immediately think that they're very dark, that they are gothic, because there's skulls. There's like all these skulls floating around the guy's head. It's just like death. When you see a skull, what do you think of?
Yeah.
death, like
Yeah.
the guy died. A skull is universally accepted as a, well, I mean, you either think of death or you think of pirates, one of the two. But I mean, pirates bring death, pirates bring death, skull, But when I start explaining that the skulls are representative of, because all the skulls are the same to some degree, and they're floating around the guy's head in general. Some of them are actually just, they look like masks. It's just the front of the skull. It's like a skull mask. And when I explain that the mask is the sort of the revelation, like you're pulling the mask off your face, it's the, stripping the ego, if you will, from revealing the true self. And that the skulls are representative, because the skull, from a literal point of view, the skull is where
Protects the brain.
Protects the brain, which makes the choices, which makes the decisions, which is where the conscious and unconscious choices are housed. It's the library of choice. It's like, so those skulls are representative of all the choices that you've made or decisions that you've made in these particular pieces, for instance, that despite having made the choices, made the decisions, moved on with your life, are still, even if you made a really stupid choice, which everyone does, we all make stupid choices at some point, and you take that choice, that skull, for instance, and you bury it in the ground because you don't want to face it, it's still there. It's still going to be there.
Yeah.
In fact, if you took the skull and you crushed the skull and you turned it into dust, it's still there. That choice was made, that part of your life. So that's what those skulls floating around his head were indicative of, about subconscious and conscious choices, about spiritual choices, everything that we've done in our lives. And the first piece is this guy who's like literally got his heart in his hands, and he's kind of looking at he's regarding his own heart. And then you see this look of expression come over their faces and go, oh, yeah, like that totally makes sense. Like I completely get it. But their first impression is like, man pulling his heart out of his chest with death around him, when actually it's a drawing of a person who is deeply self-regarding his choices, so like, that's like what you said earlier, the transcendence of art. You see this eureka moment come over people's faces and go, but then I must say, I've actually had some people walk in and go, is he thinking about all the decisions and choices he's made in his life while he looks at his heart and thinks, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what he's doing, So, it's so subjective, and that's what's so magical about it, because I mean, every year that we open the studios for the Komiki Open Studios, I think it's the first weekend of December every year. There are about 23, 24 artists in Komiki, where I live, seaside town of Komiki, and they do it in Riebeek Kasteel as well. It's become a bit of a thing. These like
I didn't know that. This is so cool.
Yeah,
now
it's
that
like
I live in Cape Town.
Yeah, it's something that I know Riebeek Kasteel. I don't know if it's called Solo Studios or Open Studios.
Yes.
And all the artists in the community get together, and for a weekend, the one in Riebeek Kasteel is quite a thing. Here in Komiki, I think it'll be our 4th year this year that we've been doing
Amazing.
it. And we put artwork up and open the doors. The gates are open, the doors are open.
Oh, that's amazing.
And there's a sign outside. There's an online platform as well where you can see all the different artists, what they'll have to offer. There's a map, digital map, and there's a physical map, like a little bit of a treasure hunt. And you can go from artist to artist, and there are printmakers and flamboyant flower painters and landscape artists and sculptors and photographers, and there are 24 different artists, and you can walk into their houses, into their studios, see where they live, see how they live, asked them endless questions. I did impromptu. Every year I do like an impromptu lesson or two, because I'll have some kid or some teenager or some young aspiring artist come through and say, so how do you do that? How do you, and I'll go, well, I mean, I don't say, oh, it's really easy. You just go like this, like actually, well, you have to start here. And in some cases, or in most cases, I end up giving stuff away, like tools, and I'm like, here's a pencil and you'll need this and you'll need that, and go off and good luck, just
That's
keep
amazing.
going. But that's every year. I think our Comic is every first, I think it's the first weekend of every in December, and and I have people coming through, and it's just amazing to see how everyone reacts. It's actually quite fascinating, because I'll be standing in the corner and I'll see some person walk in and go, like, you can actually almost hear them like audibly go, whatever, like, what is this stuff? Like, you see the expression on their face, like they're like, oh God, no, absolutely not. No, I don't like this stuff. This is shit. Excuse my French. They're like, no, it doesn't work for me at all. And out she'll go. Just literally, like, they walk in, they're in and out in seconds, and I'm like, you didn't even like
give it a chance.
You didn't even give it a chance. Whereas I have other people. I literally have had other people come back 2 days in a row and hang out for like an hour and a half to two, asking endless questions, and just like, oh, this piece is so amazing, or that, or whatever. Last year, some woman walked in and she walked out with a few $1,000 worth of art in one particular, it's just a print, actually. It was just a print on canvas, but it was still quite valuable. And she walked in, and there was just some feeling that it was like an intuitive thing, and she just loved the work so much. And I'd had it up on the wall for a couple of years. Everybody loves it. It's the Arctic terns. It's like this picture of birds, and it's a flurry of birds, almost like a murmur. It's not a murmur. It's just a flock of birds, seagulls. The Arctic tern. They're not really seagulls, but anyway. And it's birds. And she looked at it and she was like, oh my word, oh my word. And it was Sunday afternoon. I knew I wasn't going to make any more sales. It had been up on the wall. It doesn't really cost me that much. Like, it's in inherent value. And I grabbed a pair of clippers and I walked towards it. And as I was doing that, I said, you can have it. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, you can have it. And I start clipping the strings off, and I take it down off the wall, and I turn around and there's just tears running down her face, and she was like, what? And I was like, no, you can have it, like, it's not, like, for me, it's just a print on canvas, that has like some monetary value. But for this particular person, it was like a turning point. It was it was a real moment. She burst into tears, and she gave me a hug, and she was like, oh my God, thank you so much. And then I heard a little bit of where she had been at and what was going on in her life, and it was a really dark time in her life, and she went home with this beautiful picture of like birds, and
that's amazing.
Sure, goosebumps.
This is the power of the artistic endeavor. Like, its value is not on the canvas; it's what it actually does to us.
Alfie, I go from hand to mouth. Some months I go from hand to mouth. I live as an artist, like, really. Like, there are moments of like abundance, and then there are other moments where, like, I as it turns out, this year got off to a really slow start. January, February, March, I had one commission, without a little bit of money in the bank, I wouldn't have made it through. It's a tough gig. It's hand to mouth. It's every day as it comes. It's every month, it's every due. You just keep going. You're freelancing, so there's no salary. There's no regular income. It's like you got to, go. I've always been okay, one way or the other. My son will always remind me when he sees me getting a little bit stressed, and I'm like, oh, geez, I don't know if I'm going to make the dues this month. And he's like, Dad, come on, and he's 16 now. But even at 12 and 13 and 14, he was like, Dad, come on. We've always been okay. And he's right. We've always been okay. One way or the other. Somehow, something happens. You just got to have, I know it sounds...
a bit of faith.
You just got to have faith, and it actually kind of works itself out. But you cannot sit back on your laurels and just have faith. You've got to stand up and you got to go.
Faith won't get you anywhere.
You got to be in this. You got to like get yourself to the table, and you got to do the work, and just do a little bit of work, and just like have faith, and it's a case of providence. I mean, there's this incredible quote that I like so much, but it's as soon as you start applying yourself, things come together in a way that begin to, it's providence, if you want to be an art, it's just, yes, exactly. It's providence. And if you're in that space, but what I was going to say on that note was that, I have been paid a lot of money for artwork, but the money doesn't matter nearly as much now, ever, always. In fact, for many, many years, I have seen tears flow through the people I've done artwork for. I've done portraits and given gifts to... I've helped people give gifts to their beloveds, and then I've been there and I've seen and witnessed these moments. The money. Ask me where the money is. Okay, it's gone, bro. It's like, I don't know where it went. In fact, I can tell you that it was probably spent before I even received it. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? It's like, God, bro. Like, oh, thank you for the balance of whatever you owe me. Gone straight off to debt, landlords and freaking whatever, But the memory of standing in that gallery with those particular clients and the people I have in mind, and even as I say it, I'm just getting like flashes, and there's just multiple, and will stay with me forever, like tears, shaking, like this couple who lost their son, and I did a portrait, and it's definitely one of the better portraits I've done of the son and her and the mother. The father commissioned me, and he had a degenerative disease, and he died at like 21, 22, 23 years old. He succumbed to this degenerative disease, and you can imagine this family. It was their only son, and you can imagine that they had gone. He was supposed to be dead at like 10, but he survived, and he just and you can imagine the amount of love and compassion and the trial and the tragedies and and all of this, and then this painting, this drawing that I did, and at quite large scale, it was almost life size, and it was beautiful. Wow. And I knew the story, I knew what had to be done, and I overextended myself. I took it to the next level. The money while I was drawing didn't matter to me because I knew where the value was. Also, sometimes when people commission me to do a portrait, as was the case recently with my last portrait, I look at it and I go, okay, so they've given me, say, whatever the budget is, let's say 10K, like that's, I've already forgotten about the value of the work because I'm looking at the piece and I'm going, this is going to be so cool. I can stop at 10K in terms of the amount of effort I put in and time and value. I can stop. But if I don't think about the money and I go on, I end up with this piece, like this really, like it doesn't become about the money anymore. It becomes about me challenging myself to take it to the next level. Like, so I overextend, not because I'm expecting more money from it or I'm expecting more reward. Yes, actually, no, that's a lie. I am expecting more reward. The reward is my own. I look at this piece and I go, this piece could be so cool. I've basically been paid, given some money to take my talent to the next level. Someone's paying me to take it to the next level. I'm not going to give them 10,000 rands worth of work. I'm going to give them 15,000 rands worth of work. In fact, I might even go all the way to 18 because, if you're measuring it from a monetary point of view, I'm pushing myself. Art, I don't know, I've lost my track, but
I think that's the beauty of it. We don't necessarily need a track when it comes to art. You just kind of express yourself, and
it was about the inherent value, like the value that, like making
the monetary value, the moment.
Monetary value, and art for me has been a journey of self-discovery. It really has. It's a process by which I've got to know myself. And in fact, if I'm honestly, I could be much better acquainted with myself if I applied myself even more to it. And I still have a long way to go. There's so much about the process of making art. There's so much about the creative process. And even now, right now, at this juncture in my life, of 20 years as a professional, I've realized how much more lies ahead. And I really look forward to it, I really do, because it's like self-revelatory stuff.
That's on a beautiful note to actually close the conversation, to end with that. But Adrian, it's been really lovely talking to you. I think we could probably go on another hour and just continue, but we all have things to do, and maybe there'll be a second episode in the future. But I'll definitely try my absolute best to come visit you in December. But for all the people listening, we will be posting all the links to Adrian's website, social media, so that you can go and see some of his work. If you want to go have a look at the list of galleries where his work is exhibiting at the moment, or contact him for commission, you can do that as well. But thank you so much for your time, Adrian. That was so lovely.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a pleasure. And I mean, like you said, it could go on for another hour. Feel free to give me a call. We can do it again.
100%. Sure.
And to all the artists out there, don't give up. Have a little bit of faith. Put in the work, and you never know where it will take you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But I think we can call it there. For everyone listening, thank you very much for this hour and a little bit that you have given us, and we will see you next time.
All right. Bye.